Chapter 1. Read by Ravi in audiobooks. Mosaddeq, Nasser, and What Could Have Been. World War II transformative events. The overthrow of Mohammad Mosaddeq in August 1953 and the Eisenhower administration's attempt to cut Nasser to size, which led to the Suez Crisis in 1956. Each of these FL ash points will be rich with detail. Far from being a simple argument that different decisions would have led to different outcomes, this chapter will lay out the puzzle of the book, arguing that these inciting ruptures set off a chain of reactions and counterreactions that dramatically changed the face of the Middle East. Although I do not draw causal links between what happened in Iran and Egypt in the 1950s and the 1960s and subsequent events, the overthrow of Mosaddeq and the confrontation with Nasser provided a trigger, a chain of crises that radically altered the trajectory of change in the region. These transformative incidents were great in FL action points in that change. The first wrong turns. Iran's PRST democratic government was toppled by a CIA-backed coup in 1953. 3 years later, America humiliated Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser in order to undermine him, and eventually, CUHFT will tell the story of the two posts to oust him, triggering the Suez Crisis, which almost precipitated a world war. These two incidents struck Middle Easterners just at a moment of hope for their region, making the blow all the more dramatic and destructive. The events corroded U.S. relations with the Arab and Muslim world, shaking the positive view that many people of these lands held of the United States in a sign of impending future trouble. The coup in Iran was the initial American foray into the dangerous role it would come to play far beyond the Middle East, making our understanding of this origin story critical to unpacking similar events in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. In contrast to other newly independent states, the Middle East was exceptional in that external powers intensely and repeatedly intervened in its internal affairs, making it, in the words of L. Carl Brown, the most penetrated region in the world. When genuinely patriotic leaders like Mosaddeq and Nasser re-emerged, their desires for meaningful independence and modernization were branded as disguised communism. While this approach was used in other regions, when it came to the Middle East, U.S. leaders rationalized their neo-imperial mission by asserting that Islam and Arab culture were incompatible with democracy. What emerged from this was a policy of backing authoritarian strongmen in the name of stability, which has become a cardinal rule of how Western governments deal with the Middle East today. Unable to quench its appetite for oil and control over the world economy, the American Republic made a conscious choice to become an informal empire, and in the process damaged American democracy and the world. But Western powers became dependent on an undemocratic Middle East. This cynical and mutually reinforcing relationship, which the sociologist Timothy Mitchell dubbed carbon democracy, was toxic to both the American Republic and the nascent post-independence nation-states in the Middle East. According to Mitchell, the relationship was based on the pipelines, oil agreements, and oligarchies that organized the supply and pricing of oil, but crucially, was accompanied by the construction of the Cold War, which provided a framework for the policing of the post-war Middle East that replaced the need for mandates, trusteeships, development programs, and other scaffoldings for imperial power. Mitchell argues that increased American interest in these post-independence Middle Eastern states during the Cold War played a key role in their slow, unstable, and lopsided development. America embarked on what amounted to an informal empire that was modeled on the dominant geopolitical paradigm reigning before it, European imperialism. Studying the history of the Cold War period will lack all context unless it is understood in the larger scheme of British and French imperialism, which drew the map of the Middle East with an eye to the ruling power's interests. Local rulers gained, maintained, and increased power by doing the bidding of the colonial masters. These pro-Western rulers enabled the integration of the Middle East into the global capitalist economy on terms favorable to the imperialists. It was difficult enough for countries emerging from colonialism to build sound institutions, gain public trust, and extend state authority, and America's actions during the Cold War made this all the more difficult, if not impossible. The Middle East was launched on the trajectory it continues today, by European imperialism and then by American interventions. Local rulers then and now are complicit in perpetuating the region's current predicament. Since these events were contemporaneous with the global Cold War, naturally communist Russia had a strong hand. That said, there are important reasons to focus on how the United States interfered with and influenced the Middle East. The United States played a preponderant role, inheriting the colonial mantle of its European allies and building an informal empire of its own with a network of friends like the Shah of Iran, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. There were signs on the road of the Khan-FL aggression that would erupt. The fallout from the 6-day Arab-Israeli War of June 1967, the continued dispossession of the Palestinians, and America's preponderant support of Israeli settler colonialism are some. Then there was the taking of American hostages in Iran in 1979, the Iran-Contra affair, and the successive wars in Iraq. The culmination came in the September 11, 2001, attacks on the American homeland. The subsequent U.S. global war on terror caused at least 4.6 million in direct and indirect deaths across CONFL-ICTs in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, and Yemen, according to the costs of war study by Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Moreover, 38 million people have been displaced or made refugees, and the United States has spent more than $8 trillion on these wars, the cost of war research suggests. 5. There were also the resulting seismic waves across Arab societies, and not least in the West, where anti-terror laws implemented to fend off the invisible enemy came at the cost of civil rights. I do not mean, however, to suggest that there is a direct, straight forward line between events in the 1950s and 1960s and those in the contemporary Middle East. My story interrogates key FL points and inciting incidents and shows how these ruptures set off a chain of reactions and counter-reactions that dramatically changed the face of the Middle East. The implications for the entire world were grave and lasting. American democracy was undermined. The venomous effect of colonial European discourse on Middle Eastern minorities has deepened and led to even more societal division and polarization. Without the United States as a beacon of democratic values, lesser powers worldwide were inspired not by Washington's admirable idealism, but by its cynical self-interest and imperial overreach. This had serious consequences for people who suffered from the actions of less prominent, but no less damaging governments. More specifically, the West's self-appointed role as a leader of the free world and defender of human rights has been deeply corroded, the ramifications going well beyond reputation. Mistrust in the international liberal order has weakened international institutions and eroded deference to norms such as respect for human rights. What unfolds in Guantanamo Bay, or Gaza, Palestine, hurts more than individuals unjustly subject to illegal torture or civilians slaughtered by the thousands. It raises the global public's tolerance for such abhorrent acts by having them unfold in the heart of the democratic West. This is not an exercise in wishful thinking and feel-good idealism. It is a rediscovery of the historical Middle East in its contentious love-hate relationship with the West. This is a transformation story because it shows how and why the Middle East was, and still is, fundamentally changed by Anglo-America's imperial meddling and intervention. Although formal colonialism ended at the end of World War II, imperialism did not. It will come as a surprise for those who like to use the Middle East as shorthand for violence. Those who might casually write, "It looked like Beirut," or "It was more explosive than Fallujah." But the region over the past century and a half has been comparatively far less violent than even Europe, which witnessed some of the greatest crimes in world history, particularly the Holocaust and subsequently genocide in Bosnia. Death tolls per capita, even by conservative estimates, show how blood-soaked CONFL-ICTs beyond the region have left their respective battlefields, whether the two world wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Balkans Wars, or the U.S. War on Terror. Ultimately, though instability persists, the Middle East level and proportion of violence have not reached such scales. There is nothing exceptional about the region's supposed ideological differences from the rest of the world, particularly the democratic deficit, the assumption that democracy is the pinnacle of state society development. Its institutions immediately and universally transferable to all contexts is not empirically valid, especially in developing countries. The political theorist S.N. Eisenhower argues against viewing the contemporary world through the lens of the cultural program of Western modernity, as most classical sociologists do. Instead, Eisenhower suggests that the idea of multiple modernities best explains the actual development of modernizing societies that have refuted the homogenizing and hegemonic Western program of modernity. In this sense, modernizing countries in the global South have a multiplicity of ideological and institutional patterns that differ from those of their Western counterparts. This premise of democratic hegemony also ignores the long and treacherous and violent context specificity path all developed Western democratic nation states take to reach the summit, if they can even be said to have reached it yet. Instead, the differences lie in the way the Middle East has been, repeatedly penetrated under various pretexts, and how this intense foreign intervention has shaped how politics is done in the region and the way outsiders deal with the region. The formative period of the post-colonial Middle East ran from 1947 to 1958. This was the season when the perennials that still bloom today were planted. Had the United States acted differently during that time, as opposed to resurrecting an informal empire, the destiny of the Middle East as well as America's standing in the Islamic world would have been radically altered and strikingly enhanced. Enter Iran, the gateway to reimagining the Middle East. Imagine you're on a spaceship orbiting Earth. Try to imagine the Middle East as it looked in the late 1940s, and now look at Iran. The first thing that will spring to your eyes is most likely the summit of Mount Damavand, Asia's second most prominent peak, after Mount Everest, towering above the clouds. Mount Damavand has a special place in Persian folklore. It symbolizes Iranian resistance to foreign domination and despotism. Zah-AK, a foreign ruler who terrorized the Iranians for 1,000 years, is said to have been chained up with a lion's pelt fixed to the walls of the mountain's cavern until the end of days. He was overthrown in a popular revolt organized by the nobleman Feridun, legitimate heir and future king, and led by the blacksmith Kava. This legend tells us that, stretching back thousands of years, the Iranians, like every other people in the world, have wanted to be free of foreign rule and despotism. Granted, there probably never existed in Iran an immortal, foreign demonic ruler with 3 mouths, 6 eyes, and 3 heads, 2 of which were snakes that had to be fed human bodies daily. But to suggest that Mosaddeq was inspired by this myth in the late 1940s and early 1950s is not completely out of place, the story bearing some resemblance to his brief premiership. Mosaddeq, a nobleman, nationalized oil as a means of strengthening Iranian economic sovereignty and wresting itself free of quasi-colonial British control. The people wanted him to nationalize the oil sector, just as the people wanted Feridun to free them of Zah-AK. Arguably, the biggest difference between the overthrow of Zah-AK and Mossaddeq's nationalization of oil was the ending. In Feridun's case, Zah-AK remained imprisoned within the walls of Mount Damavand forever. The people got their will, and Iran was free again. But in Mossaddeq's case, the oil soon came under foreign control once again, and the Iranian people went back to even heavier foreign-sponsored despotism. Spillovers of that struggle still haunt them to this day. The country, which would come to be known as the enduring enemy of the United States, subject to repeated and increasingly stringent sanctions and sirens of wars, was an emerging democracy in the late 1940s and early 1950s. By any objective measure, there were prospects for democracy consolidating in Iran at this time looked promising. But rather than allowing the flourishing of this legitimately liberal government, led by Prime Minister Mosaddeq, the CIA orchestrated a coup and deposed him. In the process, the U.S. spy agency toppled much more than the Iranian people's choice of leader. It dealt a body blow to America's moral compass and democratic soul. The reverberations were felt far beyond the Middle East, lending weight to this reconstructed history as a valuable prism through which to view the globe. By the early 1950s, American democracy was stealthily hijacked by the creeping military-industrial complex and imperial seekers. The coup in Tehran also undermined the legitimacy and potency of international institutions, such as the United Nations Security Council. This was more than a policy miscalculation. It was a neon sign, ashing an unmistakable message. The United States would oppose independent and legitimate leaders like Mosaddeq and later the assertive Nasser, who insisted on full political autonomy and who sought to mobilize natural resources and economic assets to lift their peoples out of abject poverty and misery. In his book, Oil and the World Order, American Foreign Oil Policy, the scholar Svante Carlson argues that the wave of nationalization that took place in the Middle East after World War II infringed one of the basic rules of the world economic order, private enterprise and ownership. He points out that in the second half of the 20th century, control of the international oil market was one of the most important keys to the control of the world order. Instead, America backed acquiescent or subservient ruling, elites, a continuing pattern of U.S. foreign policy today. Political and economic interests matter more to the United States than the values it preaches. America's unconscionable removal of Iran's legitimate leader sowed the seeds of the 1979 Iranian Revolution and set the course for acrimonious relations that still exist now. Of course, there is no direct line between 1953 and 1979, but values were corrupted. Constitutionalism, liberalism, and pluralism in Iran suffered a critical blow, and as a result, Iran's political and developmental trajectory was disrupted and altered, which empowered radical and revolutionary ideologies like Marxism and Shia Pan-Islamism. Although Iran experienced some economic growth under the Shah, it was uneven, lopsided, fueled by oil wealth, and not based on a diversified and productive economy. Iran under the Shah neglected agriculture, which turned this rich soil country into a food importer and a commodity-dependent economy. The legacy was an Iran dominated by political authoritarianism under both the repressive rule of the Pahlavi monarchy and the subsequent clerical takeover in the early 1980s. One aspect of this reconstruction of the history of the Middle East asks how different Iran might have been today if there had been no CIA coup in 1953. Imagining an Iran without oil as a prominent feature in its internal and external affairs offers a vast and vastly different trove of outcomes. A democratic Iran could have been at peace with itself as well as an example for neighboring states. Iranians generally agree that the coup against Mosaddeq derailed an emergent democratic sensibility. Others go further by arguing that democracy and political secularism, values that are routinely invoked by the United States, would have established deep roots in their country. Without this transformative event, Ayatollah Khomeini, who would spearhead the Islamic takeover of Iran in 1979, might never have gone into exile in Iraq in the 1960s or gained national and international stardom. The CIA-sponsored coup against Mossaddeq arrested Iran's political and social development. The country veered off course, never regaining its democratic spirit. Or rather, it was steered off course, aided a great deal by the United States in developing its repressive institutional design in the forms of secret police and maximum security prisons. These repressive apparatuses were later inherited by the Iranian theocracy from 1979 onward, and ironically now fuel U.S. narratives on Tehran's cruelty and despotism. MYY reconstruction of the Middle East allows readers to enter a world where Iran follows its rightful and proper path to develop into a secular-leaning, modernized, and industrialized nation. Its petroleum reserves and skilled labor force could have allowed a genuinely representative government to support the diversification of a commodity-dependent economy and a better distribution of wealth. This diverse and inclusive economic choice could have ushered in a future as an economic power and an emerging market following the path of the four Asian tigers, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and South Korea. A wealthy, high-tech, industrialized club of impressive economic development, rather than that of an oil-dependent economy. Greater opportunity could have fostered a culture of respect for human rights and the rule of law, as well as women's empowerment. Instead of the present image of a rogue and dangerous country so successfully manufactured and sold to Western audiences, Iran might have taken its place as a responsible member of the international community, a civilization rich not only in petroleum, but also in history, culture, and diversity. Read by Arabian Audiobooks. Egypt's Seeds of Peace. If Iran is the gateway to imagining a new future, Egypt is the garden where we could fly in peace if only the seeds had been nurtured. Nasser had been positively predisposed toward the United States, but this potential friend was turned into an embittered foe when in July 1956, President Eisenhower delivered a humiliating public smack when he revoked an offer of nearly $70 million in aid to Egypt for the construction of the Aswan Dam on the Nile River. This was not a miscalculation on the part of the Eisenhower administration. Rather, it was a conscious strategy to force a newly decolonized leader to align with the U.S.-led capitalist camp against Soviet communism and eschew state-led development. Absent this ill-fated move, the Egyptian leader would arguably not have entered a tactical relationship with the Soviet Union, and all the fallout that ensued might have been avoided, namely the Suez Crisis later in 1956, and even more crucially, the Six-Day War in June 1967. In their stead, the world could have benefited from a more stable region led by a prosperous and peaceful Egypt, and many lives would have been spared. There is ample evidence of rich soil in this garden. Nasser had no ideological prejudice against the United States and admired American culture. Soon after the overthrow of the pro-British monarchy in Egypt in 1952, he watched Esther Williams movies in the American embassy and wished for his people the same level of prosperity that he saw in those films. Spending time there, Nasser tried to build a close relationship with U.S. diplomats, who then had the foresight to recommend that Washington befriend the new Egyptian leader. The divisions between those in Washington and American officials in Cairo soured U.S.-Egyptian relations. The U.S. media irresponsibly and provocatively poured gasoline on a raging war by painting the young Egyptian colonel as an expansionist dictator in the mold of Hitler and Mussolini. This stood in sharp contrast to how Nasser was viewed by the Americans who personally knew him from their long social encounters in the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. At this early stage of the Egyptian Revolution, Nasser, a young mild colonel, had not developed a radical sensibility yet, and his worldview was fluid and evolving. Even before the revolution, Nasser and other army officials hoped that America could help in deterring Britain from sabotaging the nascent Republican order in Cairo. Nasser said that America was the only power capable of stopping any British intervention against the revolution. A close army of Vice or a friend of Nasser told me. My argument in this book is that American officials could have capitalized on opportunities to engage with Nasser, a proud, authentic leader who struggled to modernize his country and free it from imperial British control. The seeds of peace sowed by these acts could have flowed into a harvest of goodwill and powerful friends for the United States in the region in the form of leaders who possessed internal political legitimacy and presided over calm, stable, and prosperous polities. Readers might find my analysis of Egypt's Nasser controversial, because he is often portrayed in the West as simply another Arab authoritarian leader with pro-Soviet leanings. My goal is to advance a more nuanced portrait of his rule and political legacy, while not exonerating him for cracking down on opposition and all forms of political dissent. Unlike Mosaddeq, Nasser was not a Democrat, but like Mosaddeq, he was a developmentalist genuinely concerned about improving the severe social and economic conditions under which most Egyptians lived, and against the odds and external pressure, he achieved results. Nasser was also an Egyptian nationalist who believed that the question of political independence is critical to the question of development at home and in neighboring Arab countries. It was this grand and principled vision that earned him legend status from Morocco to Yemen and beyond. Despite his political authoritarianism, Nasser was a unifying and inspirational leader in Egypt. Like Iran, a peaceful, prosperous, and strong Egypt could have been the cornerstone of the Arab foundation for democracy. To many people in Egypt and the Arab world, Nasser was an authentic leader, in touch with the grassroots sentiments of the average citizen and fighting for their dignity. Evidence of this is in our lived history. Many countries of the post-colonial world that are democracies today, FI-RRC, experienced a period of authoritarian rule after independence before they underwent a transition to democracy. South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Ghana, and Senegal come to mind. Moreover, the Western states' own road to democracy had not been linear or peaceful. It had been long and treacherous, evolving over centuries and taking many forms. If the post-independence international and regional context had been more propitious, could Egypt's political and economic development trajectory have been different? This book guides the reader in contemplating this critical question. While it is difficult to precisely determine the unlimited potential of the peace dividend, we can say for sure that the United States would have avoided deadly military entanglements in the region, keeping its troops home instead of sending thousands of boots on the ground to defend the status quo and suffering substantial financial, moral, and physical losses. Middle Eastern peoples would have continued to view the United States as an extension of the philanthropical and progressive American civil society, entrepreneurship, and missionaries that had operated in the region before the 1950s. Then the waste and destruction wrought by the informal empire's military-industrial complex would have been replaced by the gain and value of investments in people engendering greater national prosperity and progress. As I mentioned in the introduction, in the early 1950s, a sharp turn away from the road taken would have steered the United States away from its embrace and nourishment of authoritarian regimes and strongmen. Instead, sleaze and corruption spread as some of those regimes became wealthy, bought think tanks in Washington, and lobbied Congress and the White House for access and influence. They metastasized the cancer in U.S. politics of allowing private money, special political and corporate interests, and lobbies to shape American foreign policy at the cost of democratic values and respect for human rights and the rule of law. America's full-throated backing of Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands is a case in point, a geostrategic curse. Like its sponsored coup against Mosaddeq, America's decision to confront Nasser in the mid-1950s not only changed the trajectory of U.S.-Egyptian relations, but also deeply shaped questions of war and peace in the Middle East. By targeting Nasser's Egypt, the United States went against a pivotal state that held great sway among Arab countries and the broader decolonizing world. Nasser retaliated by trying to discredit the Arab monarchs and presidents who joined U.S. imperial networks and defense pacts, which led to a prolonged proxy conflict known as the Arab Cold War. This strife between Arab countries had local roots, but the United States blew on the fire arrow. The consequences were compromising inter-Arab cooperation and weakening the newly established Arab League, not unlike Iran. After 1953, the Arab state system never recovered its balance and equilibrium. Geopolitical rivalries tore up plans and hopes for regional economic cooperation and integration. At the risk of being simplistic, I argue that America's post-World War II imperial ambitions and its offensive conduct in the early decades of the global Cold War triggered something resembling a geostrategic curse in the Middle East. This geostrategic curse has affected the region since the 1950s, which coincided with U.S. grand strategy to build an informal empire and roll back Soviet communism. The internationalization of local and regional politics has played a major role in the maintenance of the status quo, blocking political progress and transformative social change. Immediately after World War II and the onset of the global Cold War, the United States, together with Britain, aimed to establish a mini Middle Eastern NATO in order to contain and strangulate the Soviet Union and to control the region's oil and energy supplies and strategic waterways. This neo-colonial agenda, or informal empire, clashed with the aspirations of local leaders like Mosaddeq and Nasser, who prioritized sovereignty, state-led development, independence, and non-alignment in foreign policy. Mossaddeq and Nasser's non-compliance with the Anglo-American demands and even resistance pitted them against the United States, which intervened covertly and overtly in an offensive to undermine their regimes. The result was to intensify geopolitical rivalries that weighed down the nascent and fragile nation-states in the region. For example, when Nasser and his Free Affaisier comrades seized power in 1952, their priorities were bread and butter and jobs. They sought to use state power to lift most of the Egyptian people out of punishing poverty and modernize and industrialize the country. Yet by the second half of the 1950s, the Free Affaisiers' agenda shifted radically from an internal focus to a regional focus, entangling the country in costly international rivalries. It would not be an exaggeration to argue that a geostrategic curse, AFFL, dictated Egyptian foreign policy and led to overextension and miscalculation. The Six-Day War in June 1967 between Israel and Egypt was a case in point. As I will show, in May 1967, preoccupied with challenges by pan-Arab nationalist rivals in Syria and Iraq, Nasser miscalculated and fell into Israel's trap and suffered a catastrophic defeat. America's imperial overreach and Cold War crusade were the spark that ignited and escalated geostrategic rivalries in the region. Writers view the global Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union as representing a philosophical and ideological fault line in international relations. In the Middle East, however, there was more convergence than divergence between the two rival superpowers when it came to social and political change. They shared a common goal of preserving the authoritarian status quo and preventing socioeconomic transformation, which allowed them to expand their influence and exercise control. When Nasser and other radical pan-Arab nationalists suppressed Marxists and socialists at home in the 1950s and 1960s, Soviet leaders turned a blind eye. They sacrificed their ideological allies on the altar of realpolitik and national security interests. Similarly, the United States backed brutal authoritarian rulers like the Shah of Iran and allied itself with ultra-conservative, far-right religious groups and acquiescent regimes like Saudi Arabia and the Afghan Mujahideen. American officials sought to combat godless communists and socialists and detain progressive and radical nationalists. Far from disappearing, this geostrategic curse is alive and well. From the beginning of the global Cold War to today, the Middle East has been a battlefield for intense geopolitical rivalries involving both external and regional powers. Time and again, these rivalries have blocked social and political change, consumed financial resources, and sustained the repressive status quo. This is not to say that if the United States had acted differently, the Middle East would not have been gripped by geopolitical rivalries. My contention is that the intensity, potency, and lasting consequences of these rivalries could easily be traced to the U.S. effort to establish a Pax Americana in the early 1950s and to confront nationalist leaders who pursued an independent posture at home and abroad. This U.S. tendency to stir up regional rivalries persists, pitting Iraq against Iran and now moderate Sunni Arab states against Shia-dominated Iran. Looking at today's most salient geostrategic struggle between Shia-dominated Iran and Sunni-majority Saudi Arabia through the lens of social and political change, we see more similarities than differences. Like the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, both Iran and Saudi Arabia share the fundamental strategic goal of maintaining the balance of social forces and crushing dissent. A core concern for Tehran's clerics and Riyadh's royals is to prevent radical change in the region, which could threaten the sectarian interests of their ruling coalitions. For instance, Iran and Saudi Arabia have fought hard to crush the Arab Spring revolts that erupted in 2010. Both regional heavyweights are leading counter-revolutionary powers. The Islamic Republic in Iran has invested blood and treasure to keep the secular nationalist Bashar al-Assad in power in Syria. The pro-Iranian Hezbollah in Lebanon, a resistance movement, justifies its defense of the Assad regime on geostrategic grounds. Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies have spent tens of billions of US dollars in a concerted campaign to thwart the Arab Spring revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen, and Libya, and later in Sudan, Iraq, and Syria. There is no doubt that this geostrategic curse is one of the significant factors that have contributed to crushing the aspirations of millions of Arabs for freedom, justice, and dignity. Likewise, geostrategic rivalries have undermined the aspirations of the Palestinians for a state of their own. Since its foundation, Israel has mastered the art of using regional rivalries for its purpose of undermining the unity of the pro-Palestinian front. Since the Iranian Revolution, Israel has played to anti-Iran and anti-Shia sentiments in the region and aided Arab autocrats to divert attention from its occupation of Palestinian lands. It has aligned itself with Arab Gulf states and the United States in an anti-Iran coalition, trumpeting the threat posed by the Islamic Republic and vowing to counterbalance it. The result is that the prospects for granting the Palestinians the right of self-determination and ending Israeli military occupation have stalled. There is no end in sight for alleviating the suffering of the Palestinian people. The role of this geostrategic curse in sustaining political authoritarianism and hindering social and political progress should not be underestimated. A close look at the current constellation of regional and global politics points to a grim situation. There exists near consensus in the United States, Europe, and the international community on the need to preserve the regional status quo, a balance of power to which Western leaders have given birth and which they have nourished over the past decades. The civil wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, and the instability in neighboring countries are cited as a cautionary tale against experimenting with change in democracy. Russia's and China's greater engagement in the Middle East reinforces this reactionary trend of eschewing change. Middle Eastern autocrats could not be happier. They sell themselves to the United States and Western Europe as preservers of stability, while warning about the destabilizing effects of promoting human rights, political participation, and the right to dissent. When they sense danger to their survival, Middle Eastern strongmen quickly recalibrate their policies and tone down the geopolitical rivalries. It is difficult to keep up with the ever-changing geostrategic regional chessboard. Of course, this geostrategic curse is not destiny. The Iranian Revolution in 1979, the Arab Spring uprisings in 2010-12, the Palestinian resistance to Israel's military occupation, as well as the subsequent wave of revolts that started in 2019, show clearly that people's agency has not yet been quelled and that it can overcome internal and external barriers. The challenge facing agents of change is to develop strategies to minimize the role of foreign stakeholders, which is easier said than done. But there is no denying that social and political progress will be difficult to institute without isolating and neutralizing geostrategic rivalries. A suitable regional context can help facilitate internal struggles for democracy. The reverse is also true. The road not taken. With this as a starting point, we follow the road not taken to see how the Middle East would look without the damaging effects of that momentous CONFL-ICT, America's imperial ambitions in the FIRST decades of the global Cold War, amplified over the years and felt intensely to this day. Key among those were the resurgence of political Islam and the spread of Sunni and Shia pan-Islamism in the Saudi and Iranian models. Both these factors are dominant features of the landscape today across North Africa and the Sahel, in Indonesia, and in large parts of South Asia. They are also found among Muslim communities in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and other countries where the ideologies have spread to people raised outside these traditions who are willing to lay their lives on the line for the cause. It is doubtful if the Six-Day War in June 1967 between Israel and its Arab neighbors would have happened if the United States had not decided to cut Nasser's wings and fully sided with Israel and anti-Nasser Muslim fundamentalists like the Saudi rulers. Key to understanding the implications of that war is grasping the fact that for many Arabs, the setback, as they call that CONFL-ICT, was far more than a military defeat. It ruptured the public imagination and robbed Nasserist Egypt of its grandeur and nationalist symbol. The defeat dramatically set back Pan-Arabism and reminded millions of Arabs of the lasting and humiliating legacy of European colonialism and U.S. informal imperialism as well. Nasser's defeat was portrayed by others as an act of punishment by God, who had forsaken Egyptians for embracing Nasser's secular illusions of progress and socialism. So far astray from the right path of what it meant to be an authentic Muslim in the modern world, smoldering in the embers of war lay the Nasserist project of secular Arab nationalism, which gave Saudi Arabia's pan-Islamism the opportunity to rise out of the ashes. With America's backing, the religious right in the Arab world was ideally placed to fill the ideological vacuum left by Egypt's defeat and Nasser's untimely death of a heart attack in 1970. Nasser's successor, Anwar Sadat, enabled the shift to religious conservatism. Seeking to rid Egypt of the outsized legacy of Nasser and build his own legacy, Sadat allied himself with Saudi Arabia and allowed the religious right to till Egypt's fertile soil. Breaking with Nasser's semi-closed economy and foreign policy, Sadat opened the Egyptian economy to global finance and joined the Pax Americana in the region. The Americans rewarded Sadat with financial aid and arms, and the U.S. media heaped praise on him as a historic leader and peacemaker. Ironically, unleashing these forces would prove to be Sadat's own undoing. His blood-stained uniform from that fateful 1981 military parade in Cairo, on display in the Library of Alexandria, tells the tale of the violent end to his 11-year tenure by the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, a group that Ayman al-Zawahiri, late head of al-Qaeda, was a member of at the time and would in 2001 merge with al-Qaeda, a few months before 9/11's. More than any other leader, Sadat unwittingly helped tilt the balance of social forces in favor of political Islam and pan-Islamism. His alliance with the Saudis came at a propitious moment when the oil revolution in the mid-1970s bolstered the conservative kingdom's finances and soft power in the Arab Islamic world. From Egypt to Afghanistan and beyond, the Saudi oil boom bankrolled the pan-Islamist resurgence that continues a half-century later. The rise of the religious right in the Arab lands coincided with the revolution in Iran in 1979, which was subsequently captured by the clerics. Pan-Islamism of both Sunni and Shia stripes, feeding on each other, spreads near and far. With America's backing, Israel has since consolidated its control of all Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, and it has annexed Syria's Golan Heights. U.S. leaders frequently pay lip service to the proposed two-state solution framework for resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict, ICT, a Jewish state for Israelis, and a Palestinian state for Palestinians. American policymakers have turned a blind eye to Israel's expanding colonial settlements and repression of the Palestinian people. Almost 1 million Israeli settlers now live in occupied Palestinian territories. As the anointed leader of the free world, the United States has consistently disregarded the human rights of Palestinian Arabs and their aspirations to self-determination. Over time, because of these double standards, Arabs and Muslims have become convinced that the United States is complicit in the Palestinian predicament. Not only have the people of the region become deeply critical of U.S. foreign policy, but their attitudes toward democracy and liberalism have hardened as a consequence. It would not be an exaggeration to argue that America's backing of Israeli settler colonialism is key to the spread of anti-American sentiments in the Middle East, as well as a contributor to a rise in extremism. The latest example of this trend is President Joe Biden's response to Hamas's bloody attack on Israel on October 7, 2023, and the subsequent full-scale Israeli military onslaught on the Gaza Strip. Saying that it would tie Israel's hands, Biden vetoed UN Security Council draft resolutions that called for a humanitarian pause and humanitarian ceasefire, as Israel bombarded Gaza, killing thousands of Palestinian civilians, including children, women, and the elderly. The Biden administration's unwavering support for Israel risks deepening and widening anti-Americanism in the Middle East and the Global South. American weapons used by Israel in Gaza have also triggered accusations of war crimes against the United States. It is worth asking, what if the United States had neither Kanyas-fronted Mosaddeq, Nasser, and other godless, socialist, and secular-leaning nationalist leaders in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere during the global Cold War, nor backed acquiescent autocrats in Israeli settler colonialism and Islamic-dominated states and movements as it did in Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan? It is very likely that political Islam and supra-Islamism might not have emerged as the most potent ideology, offering an alternative identity to nationalism and radical Arabism embodied in the secular nation-state. Religion would have been a far weaker tool for political mobilization, resulting in a vastly different political landscape. Had Egypt not been militarily crushed in 1967, the cascading events that followed might have been avoided. Sadat might not have aligned his country with Saudi Arabia. The United States might not have relied so heavily on Saudi Arabia and Israel, and the 9/11 attacks might never have happened. These are not far-fetched or imaginary scenarios, but important themes grounded in historical fact and based on an understanding of real forces that have shaped the Middle East's destiny in the second half of the 20th century. The lives spared and human progress secured expand further when we consider that if Sadat had not isolated Egypt from the rest of the Arab world in the 1970s, the consequences in Lebanon would have been profound. The subsequent inter-Arab rivalries converged with social and economic inequities in Lebanon, which led to the country's implosion. Lebanon was a model of religious and ethnic tolerance that might have been nurtured, scaled up, and adopted elsewhere. Instead, the country became the scene for 15 years of one of the most heartbreaking civil wars ever to befall the region. Rather than that tragedy, one might instead imagine a Lebanon that would have gradually shed its sectarian power sharing and replaced it with a constitutional contract based on citizenship. The United States changed the course of history by trying to impose its new imperial vision and Cold War obsession with Soviet communism on the newly independent states in the Middle East and other regions. This trampled on the aspirations of indigenous nationalist leaders like Prime Minister Mosaddeq in Iran and President Nasser in Egypt, the architects at home, and what they could have built. Although labeled superpowers for their potency, the United States and Soviet Union were far from alone in driving the history of the Middle East. In reality, the leaders across the region were also responsible for the existing calamity. Officials such as Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, Nasser, David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, Sadat, Hosni Mubarak, Saddam Hussein, and Hafez al-Assad all played their roles in causing the current predicament. We can clearly see what would have happened if Nasser had not acted impulsively in May 1967, giving Israel a justification to preemptively attack Egypt a month later. We can easily imagine how Egypt would have progressed and developed its institutions if Nasser had tamped down his anti-democratic beliefs and tolerated peaceful political dissent. We understand what might have been if Nasser's successor, Sadat, had genuinely pursued self-sustaining and inclusive economic and political development rather than crony capitalism and flirting with religiosity and Islamism as a counterweight to secular ideologies. And we see how Egypt could have served as a model of open society for other Arab countries, thwarting the rise of political authoritarianism and political Islam as the dominant force in Arab politics. We could envision the Arab states succeeding in turning the League of Arab States into a regional organization such as the European Union if geostrategic rivalries had not intensified yet after the mid-1950s. An Arab Union might have been a global powerhouse, able to rise above the intra-elite rivalries that have long paralyzed the League. In Israel, we can witness what might have been if Prime Minister Ben-Gurion had agreed to international initiatives in the 1950s to reconcile with the Palestinians and the Arabs. Had he given up the dream of a greater Israel, Israelis and Palestinians might be living side by side in peace, a secure Israel fully integrated into an Arab neighborhood. The tragedies averted are incalculable, the financial savings astronomical, and the ramifications around the world profound, since the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict ICT has been used to justify radical movements from the Sahel in Africa to South Asia and beyond. Meanwhile, in Iran, we can imagine what would have happened if the radical Islamists had not hijacked the revolution in 1979. Iran's role in fueling the spread of pan-Islamism might have been forestalled. Saddam Hussein's wars, including the ill-fated invasion of Kuwait in 1990, inflicted a national tragedy on Kuwaitis and Iraqis as well. His monstrous miscalculations led to the destruction of the Iraqi state and the pauperization of the Iraqi people. Even if the 9/11's terrorist attacks had unfolded as they did, had President Bush not used them as a pretext for his global war on terror, the focus could have remained on the perpetrators who carried out the attacks. Bush escalated by invading and occupying Afghanistan and Iraq and destroying the states, not just the Taliban and the Saddam Hussein regimes. The consequences of the U.S.-led invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq are catastrophic for both countries and others as well. It will take Iraq decades to recover from dismantling its institutions, as authoritarian as they were, and shattering the fragile coexistence among its diverse communities. Although U.S. military forces withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021, officially ending the occupation, the Costs of War report notes that Afghans are suffering and dying from war-related causes at higher rates than ever. The irony is that the Taliban seized power in 2021, 20 years after their removal by the United States. As the reader will see in the following pages, Bush's global war on terror follows a pattern in U.S. foreign policy toward the devil's open world that has been in place since the early decades of the global Cold War. Al-Qaeda was a child of the Cold War. The mass murder of Americans on 9/11s, while morally indefensible, did have roots in cynical and catastrophic decisions by U.S. leaders. Instead of reflecting on how to prevent further bloodshed by rethinking their approach, they doubled down on failed policies, which led to disastrous consequences for people in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. Instead of cultivating the good faith friends they might have made within and beyond the Middle East, they lashed out angrily at real and imagined enemies. By invading and occupying two Muslim countries, Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003, the United States created conditions for the emergence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2004 and its successor, the even more infamous Islamic State, in 2014. President Bush might have left a different legacy in the Middle East. Instead of his search for phantom weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, he could have used 9/11s as a catalyst to re-educate Americans about the world and invest in a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. He could have realigned U.S. foreign policy by cultivating valuable allies in the Arab world while winning the hearts and minds of millions of Arabs and Muslims. Given the far-reaching ramifications of events in both Iran and Egypt, as well as other incidents, we are left with the question of what might have transpired if the progressive nationalist visions of Mosaddeq and Nasser had been allowed to run their natural course. Lessons learned can help provide a way forward.